Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Athur Mabiso, and I'm a senior economist at the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And today I will be presenting on the lessons we've been learning at IFAD based on our impact assessments with respect to investments in value chain development. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Okay, and then I'll put this into presentation mode. So basically, this presentation showcases some results from our impact assessments, and it's a work that's also done together with a colleague, Tisorn Songsermsawas. So to start off with, I thought it would be important to start off with the background and essentially looking at the types of data that are available, which can help us to understand what's happening in value chains and what the investments we make can lead to in those value chains. And just really want to highlight that most of the data we have and most of what's available out there is really relying on household survey data. This is the main source of data with respect to understanding the impacts of value chain development. However, we know that there are also agricultural surveys and censuses that can be quite useful in terms of understanding what's happening, particularly on the farm. And so a lot of analysis looking at farm level or plot level data. We also know that for us to understand markets and value chain development, you need market data. And primarily, most of the data that's available out there is focused on prices, which are collected in most of the major local markets or selling points. But we do also know that some important insights can be gained from data on farmer organizations or producer organizations, such as cooperatives, as well as the actual contracts that often are drafted as part of contract farming. More recently, data are beginning to emerge from various types of digital platforms, such as e-commerce platforms or mobile transaction data, as well as data on farm input suppliers and service providers such as microcredit institutions. Of course, all these different types of data being collected using a variety of methods. And so you tend to have quite a bit of variability in the quality of data and standards, and usually a lack of consistent metadata. And also the data generation methods are often quite variable. So you might find that some surveys are using the computer-assisted personal interviews approach or phone surveys, sometimes diaries, and then in other cases really using paper-based personal interviews, which are not really recommended in this day and age. Another consideration has to do with the frequency of data collection. So with price data, for example, you'll typically have a time series, which is either collected on a daily or weekly basis. And then in some of the household surveys, which are really useful, you will have panel or longitudinal data. For our purposes, we also consider whether we are looking at collecting data for the purpose of impact evaluation or assessment, or simply to generate descriptive statistics. And so in the case of the work that we do at IFAD, we have an approach that makes sure we have treatment and control groups, and most of the cases using ex post data, although we do have cases where we also are using ex ante data. And so purpose really drives, to a large extent, the design of the data collection methods and the type of data that are collected and put together to analyze the value chains. Now, just another note on various data sources and particularly on non-traditional data sources. Increasingly, we are using Earth observation and GIS remote sensing data. And in this regard, just a plug on the recommendation to use standardized shapefiles and georeferencing approaches, which are key elements to enable interoperability of data. Of course, there's also the advent of big data and approaches such as web scraping and text data, to enable machine learning approaches, and to less extent, blockchain or distributed ledger technology applications which generate data, particularly transactions data. Now, in all this, I think one of the major concerns has to do with privacy and protection of data, particularly personal data, which is something that we all have to consider, and we do consider as we collect and manage data sets. Another aspect, which is also an opportunity, particularly when it comes to value chain development, is the ability or opportunity to actually collect data from agri SMEs, fintechs, or multinational conglomerates that do procure a large amount of their raw materials from small scale producers in order to process and then market globally, for example, their outputs. And in this case, often there are intermediaries, transporters, as well as third-party certifiers that do also generate data as they engage with these different types of players in the value chain. And so when we begin to think about, how we might improve the use of data to understand value chains, we do need to think about all these different types of data and making sure that interoperability can actually effectively happen. And a recommendation here is to use standards on unique identifiers and key variables and formats to enable linking of multiple data sources for rich analyses. Another consideration here, which is something that is referred to in a paper by Van Hulen and Abu Bakr, it refers to the financialization of value chains. And here we're referring to how all the different aspects of the value chain, receiving different types of financial instruments and interventions, all the way from matching grants, guarantees, credit lines, including other financial services such as insurance and risk sharing mechanisms. And the reason why we highlight this is that as we begin to think about aspects around investments in value chains and how that impacts the different actors in the value chain, it's important to potentially consider these various financial service providers as an important source of data. To date, not a lot has really been done to really track the levels of investments as well as the types of instruments that are being used. So something to think about. And then also the obvious digitalization of value chains and ICT4D approaches, which also can offer data generation processes that can also be incorporated to have a more comprehensive analysis of value chains. Now, with that, I will now switch to the lessons we are learning from our own impact assessments. And the projects that I will highlight here, which are value chain investments that IFAD supported, can be basically broken down into two types. So those that focused on supporting domestic staples, and then those that focused on export crops. In the case of staples, we have a project in Tanzania which focused on providing financial services, road infrastructure and markets, and promoting productivity, increasing agricultural technologies. This is mostly focusing on maize and rice. In Mozambique, a similar type of project, although this focused on horticulture, cassava, and red meat. And the data that we will focus on in this particular case is for cassava. And then in Zambia, a project called the Smallholder Productivity Promotion Program, which focused on increasing productivity in a sustainable manner and working through farmer field schools to promote the production of maize, cassava, and mixed beans. As for the export crop projects, one in Papua New Guinea that focused on cocoa and coffee value chains, linking the farmers to markets, as well as providing cocoa clones and farm management practices, and in this case, to address a particular pest, the cocoa pod borer pest that was affecting the crops, as well as investments in road infrastructure to link the farmers to the markets. In the Solomon Islands, a project similar to the one in Papua New Guinea, focusing on cocoa and coconut. And in this case, again, providing market linkages to the farmers, as well as infrastructure and various services to enhance production and productivity. And then finally, a project in Nicaragua, where they essentially are focused on cocoa and coffee as well, through business plans and providing rural financial services for productive infrastructure, as well as addressing issues of climate, and so enabling farmers to adapt to climate change through an early warning climate information system that was provided. Now, obviously, as you can see, these are projects with quite a lot of heterogeneity, both in terms of their interventions, but also the context. So the countries themselves are quite different, which obviously makes it difficult to generalize the results that we find. Also, which value chains you're looking at, that can vary. And again, this issue of whether you look at domestic versus export value chains could also, have implications in the kinds of results you might find. Just want to mention that for our purposes, we also look at whether it is possible to conduct an impact assessment. So a variability is now a factor, which means then you're not looking at all the different value chains that might have been supported. And then, of course, the specific interventions. In some cases, if it's sort of the soft interventions, training, or a hardware type of intervention such as infrastructure, then that again would influence the kinds of impacts you might see from the results. Really making the case that one has to really think carefully about the context and the farming systems, and whether the remoteness of the area or connectivity could then influence the general environment in which the impact assessment is being conducted. With respect to the samples that we have, generally large enough samples which were calculated. So we had a power analysis that was done prior to data collection to inform how big the samples needed to be. And so you'll find that pretty large samples at household level. And in the case of a few cases, particularly in Papua New Guinea, the samples were actually stratified. So you actually had large enough samples to make inferences for each value chain. With respect to the methods of analysis, we're mostly using statistical matching techniques, so running treatment effects models. And our matching procedure basically starts off with the ex-ante matching using baseline characteristics at community level prior to sampling, and that informs our sampling strategy. Then using baseline and time invariant variables at household level after survey. So this is ex post, so double matching approach. And then we also incorporate GIS remote sensing data to match as well as for control variables. So some examples of the variables we use include rainfall, temperature, altitude, and other indicators. And just to note that in our surveys, we also collect community level data, which provides variables that we can also use for controls in our models. So what results do we have from these analyses? Generally, what we find is that our projects are having a huge impact on production consistently across the board. So you can see for the domestic crops or the staple crops, impacts ranging from 14% all the way to 64% on production. So an increase in production when you compare the treated households compared to the non-beneficiary households. However, on market access, there's variability. So in some cases, we do find significant impact. For example, in Zambia, 48% increase in market access. And this, we're measuring it in terms of sales. So the actual revenue generated from selling their crops. And then if we measure it in terms of probability to sell, in terms of whether they sold or not, then you do see in some cases an increase, for example, again, mostly in Zambia and Mozambique. But in general, most of the impacts are in production. We also have a measure on resilience to shocks, which we call the ability to recover index. And there we don't see a whole lot of impacts. So obviously, more might need to be done with respect to thinking about how you actually make these projects also build resilience, particularly to climate change. Then you'll note that we also look at the diversification of income. And in this case, with the staple crops, not a lot of impacts, except in the case of the Mozambique project, where we did see a 15% increase in the income diversification index. When we look at the export crops, and I'll start with the results on the income diversification, you actually find interesting results in that there begins to be some specialization happening. Actually, the project reduces the diversification of income, And so one may think about, whether that then could potentially expose the beneficiaries to risks if any shocks happen in that particular value chain. With respect to resilience, we do actually find significant positive impacts on our ability to recover index, which is quite encouraging. So while we are reducing diversification of income, at least these farmers are saying they feel that they're more resilient to shocks. Again, with respect to production, significant impacts, in some cases really large impacts, as well as market access. So it looks like a lot of the value chain investments are working, enabling farmers to produce as well as to market their outputs and really, generate incomes for them, their families and their households. One note here on the Nicaragua project, the project areas where the project implementation took place were actually affected by hurricanes. And so we see that to a large extent, there is not a lot of positive impacts. However, we still see some increase in their responses on ability to recover from shocks. So suggesting that even though there was no difference in incomes or production or actual market access, these particular producers felt that they were better positioned to recover from the shocks that they experienced. When we look at impacts on total income, and this is now not only the income from the value chains that are promoted, but the whole income that the household has, we don't find a lot of impacts. In a few cases, there are positive impacts, but you do find that in some cases, income is not really changing, it's not increasing. And so that's something which then means that we need to think about how do we integrate various interventions to really generate a larger total income, not just more income in the value chain that is promoted. On assets, that's an area where we do find significant impacts to a large extent. So interesting to note that there are positive impacts on assets, which perhaps also could be a factor in terms of their perception of ability to recover from shocks. Now, moving on to food security and dietary diversity. Here we find interesting results, and I'll present a few results, not for all the projects. So you find that in Papua New Guinea, really positive impacts on the food insecurity experience scale. So if you look at the extent to which the treated households are reporting experiencing hunger or running out of food, for example, or eating less, that is much more reduced. However, when you look at the dietary diversity index or dietary diversity household dietary diversity score, there is actually interesting results here, where while they do consume, quite a large percentage of households reporting that they consume fruits and vegetables, there is also a huge increase in consumption of oils and sweets. And one might consider some of these types of food groups as non-healthy foods. And we find similar results in the case of Tanzania, where again, while we do see a generally high consumption of vegetables, fruits, and protein-based foods, there is also an increase in the consumption of food groups that might be considered non-healthy foods. So something that we're discovering from our results, which then means that we do need to think about how we incorporate, different interventions to promote food security and nutrition, and make sure we're not creating a different problem of, obesity and the like. Just to note that in the case of Nicaragua, we do actually find interesting positive results, where we did see an increase in consumption of vegetables and fruits, as well as important protein foods such as eggs, and at the same time a reduction in the consumption of oils and sweets. So in that case, it looks like the interventions also through mainstreaming activities seem to have had a positive impact also on dietary diversity. So what are the key lessons we learned from all this? Well, first, value chain data systems and standards are needed. We need data that allow multiple types of data to be linked, and this means interoperability, to enable richer analysis of value chains. What we've presented here mostly focused at the household level using the household level data. But to really understand the impacts across the whole value chain, it would require a multiple sets of data which potentially could come from different sources. With respect to the actual programmatic lessons, we learned that investing in value chains, particularly in the midstream, does enable the maximization of benefits to the farmers. So when we link farmers to the market and invest in the midstream, it ensures impacts on production do translate to increased revenues and incomes. What we noted, particularly when we look at the results from Nicaragua, is that measuring resilience in the entire value chain requires a lot more data, so data beyond the farm or household level. And again, different approaches would be needed, so you might need new tools or different tools and data to understand the implications of these shocks on different aspects of the value chain. What we do find, at least based on those results, is that strengthening resilience requires designs that address chronic and acute shocks. And essentially, different tools, adaptation strategies to shocks, as well as safety nets and insurance or loans and credit, could be important interventions to incorporate in the value chain projects. Our other lesson here is that investments in value chains can generate positive impacts on food security and dietary diversity, but could also potentially generate negative impacts. And so it's important to then mainstream nutrition and behavioral change insights as part of value chain investments to go beyond impacts on production and income and avoid consumption of unhealthy foods. Now, this means that we need data on food diets and consumption. And indeed, when we are able to integrate these types of questions in our surveys, and this can be done easily, it offers important insights on the impact of value chain investments on nutrition and health. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.